Land. Thank you all for being here. This is live from City Hall, our forum on Santa Barbara's rent stabilization ordinance. I'm Rich Applebaum, member of the Free Panthers Board of Directors and today's moderator. I'm going to set things in motion with a little bit of my own personal history, explain why I'm involved. And since I can never resist, I have some relevant data also. I have been rethinking rental housing for a long time, actually since 1971, when I first moved here and I was a renter. I even wrote a book about it called Thinking Rental Housing. And I'm now, no, I'm not. Even then, rents were becoming unaffordable. And I was a strong advocate for moderate rent control, which was being adopted throughout California. Alas, however, not in Santa Barbara. It's been proposed and discussed many times over the past half century with no luck until now. The city is now in the process of developing a rent stabilization ordinance, RSO for short, which will be adopted later this summer and become effective next January. It's important to understand that rent stabilization is not classical rent control, which often lock the unit itself into a permanent rent freeze, even when tenants moved out. Rent stabilization is far more moderate. It typically allows annual rent increases that are tied to a measure like the Consumer Price Index and applies to the tenant, not the unit. When a tenant voluntarily moves out, the landlord can raise rents as high as the market will bear. This is called vacancy decontrol. I emphasize the word voluntarily and voluntarily moves out because tenants are also protected with just cause eviction protections. They can't be arbitrarily evicted just so the landlord can raise rents beyond the allowable annual increase. Also, under a 1995 Santa Barbara state law, Costa-Hawkins, which you'll hear more about in a little bit, only older units, those that were first occupied prior to 1995, are subject to any form of rent regulation. In the city of Santa Barbara, there's a rough estimate that at least 13,000 older rental units are subject to rent stabilization. Why is this R so needed? Last year, the city's own rent survey put the median one-bedroom apartment in Santa Barbara at nearly $2,900 a month, and a two-bedroom at $3,900. Is that working? Is that going through okay?
Just a little louder, yeah.
Rents have risen roughly 2/3 in a decade. To afford a one-bedroom apartment here, you'd have to earn at least $115,000 a year or $55 an hour in a full-time job. Nearly half of all renter households already spend more than a third of their income on housing. Why are the Green Panthers concerned with this? Our mission is to educate, advocate, and agitate. I think you can see our sign on issues that affect older adults, and a surprising number fall into this category. According to the city's housing element, an estimated 4,200 seniors at least live in rented
Many
homes.
older adults face hidden.
Google Gemini, I would like to.
For someone my age living on Social Security, I won't share my age, a large rent hike isn't a budgeting problem. It's the difference between aging in place and being pushed out of our community. Nor is this only a renter's issue. On economic grounds, we all pay for it. For example, one reason the city has a budget crisis is that it struggles to keep pace with what its own staff must earn simply to pay for housing. There's also an environmental cost. Workers who have to commute long distances get to their jobs here because they can't afford to live in the community they serve. One final point. Rent stabilization will not solve the housing crisis. I think of it as a Band-Aid to stem the bleeding, while one way to keep rents from spiraling ever upward as they have in the past. It holds rents at more predictable levels of increase while we pursue more lasting solutions. I have lots of thoughts on what those solutions might be, but tonight our focus is on rent stabilization. Let me say a few words about the format. We are designed to share information and have a discussion. This is not a debate. We'll first do presentations from each of our panelists, then open it up to Q&A. Put your questions in the chat. We'll address as many as time allows. And make sure your microphones are silenced. You really don't want to share your private conversations with your kids or your cat with the rest of the world. The city's public comment period closes tomorrow, so what you put in the chat can become part of the official record. Let me just briefly introduce our panel and then we'll get started. Carolyn Payne is the City of Santa Barbara's Housing and Homeless Service Director. Actually, you're over in that direction on the screen. Who will walk us through the facts of the current RSO and where it stands in the process. Her role is to inform, not to advocate. Stanley Tomkov is co-founder and volunteer organizer with the Santa Barbara Tenants Union. Anna Arce is policy advocate with Cause Santa Barbara. Together, they play a leading role, I would say the leading role, in providing tenants voices, what renters have to live with every day, and some of the key issues that need to be addressed as the RSO is finalized. Finally, special shout out to Ava McCrae, our web mistress, who is managing our technology, and the session will be posted thanks to her on the Great Panel website. Carolyn, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So as Rich said, I'm the Housing and Homeless Services Manager of the city, and my role will be mostly about implementation if when we get to a rent stabilization ordinance. And Barbara Anderson, who's been leading the efforts with the city and facilitating the ordinance development, couldn't be here today, but she did drop some notes of key points that I'm going to go over just so that we all have a good, accurate sense of where the draft is at this current point in time, which is the draft that is out for public comment. And as Rich noted, the public comment period does close at the end of the day tomorrow. And so anything that is submitted during public comment or in the meeting here today will be included and incorporated into the council agenda report on the ordinance, which is currently scheduled for July 28th at an estimated time of 5 p.m. It is worth noting that as the comments, if there are lots of complicated changes that haven't been yet discussed, that are a part of that council agenda report, that may change what that conversation is at council on July 28th, but currently is to go over the draft of the ordinance. Staff also has to consider the legal implications and administrative implications of the proposed changes to the ordinance, and so this will also be a part of the council agenda discussion. So currently, I'm going over some key points. So the rent stabilization ordinance covers certain rental units as Rich mentioned. So these are older multifamily units that were built before February 1st, 1995, or received a certificate of occupancy before February 1st, 1995. It also covers single family homes owned by corporations, real estate investment trusts, or limited liability companies, recognizing that institutional landlords operate differently than individual homeowners. State law limits what cities can regulate, and this is driving which units are covered and which aren't. Owner-occupied duplexes are exempt because of the relationship that is fundamentally different between a landlord that lives on site who has a personal stake in the property than a landlord that has an investment property. And also we are exempting mobile home parks because these are already covered under a separate chapter of our municipal code. It is worth noting that deed restricted affordable housing is currently exempt in the draft ordinance. However, this will continue to be a part of the discussion with council as we've received a number of public comments in support of and as well as against this exemption. So it is a point of contention in the community. So going into the formula, the annual adjustment formula currently in the draft is the core of rent stabilization. The landlord may not raise the rent above the base rent plus any authorized annual adjustment. Landlords retain the ability to charge market rate to a new tenant when the unit is vacated. Rent increases are limited to once per year per unit. The ordinance also includes a transparency requirement. Landlords must affirmatively inform tenants that the rent stabilization ordinance exists. Each year, the maximum allowable rent increase is currently proposed at 60% of the change in consumer price index, CPI, or 3%, whichever is less. And this formula was chosen during a previous conversation at council and is also the lowest rent cap that has precedent of being legally defensible in court. There will be a petition process. A fair return petition is required. It's a constitutional requirement, so that we must have a process for a fair return petition. This means that landlords can petition to ensure that they are getting a fair return on their investment. If the annual adjustment is insufficient for the landlord to maintain their net operating income as of the 2025 baseline, they can petition for an additional increase. The standard is maintenance of net operating income, and it looks at whether or not gross rental income minus allowable operating expenses still yields a fair return. The 2025 base year reflects the current market conditions and is presumed to have a fair rate of return, but landlords who believe otherwise can refute that presumption during our petition process. The current ordinance also allows for a capital improvement pass-through, which allows landlords who invest a meaningful, durable improvement into their property. They may petition for the pass-through of a portion of that cost to the tenants. This will be limited to the lesser of 10% of the tenant's monthly rent or $100 per month. If a landlord has failed to maintain habitable conditions, they cannot use this mechanism and petition for a capital pass-through. There's also a mechanism where tenants can petition for a downward rent adjustment. So if there are habitability concerns or failures, or there is a reduction in rent services such as parking, maintenance, laundry, they can petition to have a rent reduction. If a tenant has been overcharged, they can petition for a refund or a downward adjustment. If a landlord doesn't comply within 30 days of the order, the tenant may withhold the authorized portion of rent. For program administration, we are looking at a day-to-day operations manager or a program administrator. We're trying to build out that role currently. These administrative functions will include maintaining the rental registry, processing registrations and exemptions, publishing annual agreements and reports, and managing the petition hearing process. The administrator will also develop and implement administrative regulations subject to the Rent Stabilization Board approval. The Rent Stabilization Board currently the ordinance establishes a 7-member Rent Stabilization Board, 2 members representing tenants, 2 members representing landlords, and 3 at-large members representing the broader community. The board's primary role is to hear appeals of hearing officer decisions. At its discretion, it may conduct a de novo hearing, meaning it can review the matter fresh and not just on the record before. The board also plays a governance role, approving the administrative regulations issued by the program administrator, and this provides an additional check on program operations. And finally, the board will serve as an advisory body, making recommendations to council on programs of improvements over time. There will also be a rent registry, and this will require that landlords register covered units, which is also part of the active conversation, and each unit will have an individual registration. The required information being discussed is unit address, bedroom and bathroom count, landlord contact information, date of ownership, current rent, the date and amount of the last rent increase, and tenant's move-in date. It is important to note that tenant information, such as name, social security numbers, are not being required. Landlords who believe their units are exempt must file a claim of exemption with supporting documentation signed under penalty of perjury. An annual renewal is required, and landlords must keep the registry up to date if property changes hands or property management or ownership. The registration deadline will be January 1st, 2027, which is this coming January, giving landlords sufficient time to comply with the registry requirement before enforcement begins. A landlord who fails to register is prohibited from advertising their unit for rent, collecting rent from tenants, evicting tenants, applying the annual rent adjustment, or filing a petition for an upward rent adjustment. The rent registry is currently proposed to have a fee associated with it. This will help cover program operations, hearing officers, registry, technology, outreach, and more. The fee is to be paid by landlords for each registered unit, and there will be an annual per unit charge. This fee has not been set, however, it has been estimated to be approximately $154 per unit. We are also discussing enforcement. The enforcement framework the city uses is the standard municipal code enforcement tools, the same mechanisms used to enforce other regulations. A significant tenant protection is the ability to raise rent stabilization ordinance non-compliance as a defense in a lawful detainer eviction proceeding. If a landlord tries to evict a tenant while out of compliance with the ordinance, the tenant can assert that as a defense in court. At this point, we've received over 300 public comments. We are incorporating those into the council agenda report and plan to go to council on July 28th. There we go. Was that 15 minutes?
Carolyn, thank you, excellent.
That's a lot of information,
Yeah.
so we can.
Lot to get there,
if,
yeah.
We need to, yeah.
One question.
Oh, okay.
Want it now?
Sure.
Okay, so Elaine Rudin said, I rented a condo and after 3 one-year leases, I could only get 30 days at a time. Is that covered in your ordinance? You wanted me out so you could raise the rent to market rate.
So I think it's important that these sorts of questions, because they are often very nuanced, be directed at our rental housing mediation board, which I don't have the number memorized, but you can find it on our website. And they can help look into these individual cases. In general, our 1-year lease requirement is actually codified in a different ordinance.
That was the only question that came up.
Okay, and Anna, Stanley, over to you too. I don't know how you divvied this up, but
Yeah, well, thank you so much for just creating the space. I think like so often this is really high stakes stuff, and so often we can't get below sort of the really high level sort of opposing our sides to it. So I think any chance that we get to educate one another and talk with each other is really nice. Appreciate y'all. So I'll just start off by saying, I'm both incredibly proud at how far we've gotten since you wrote this book in 1971, right? It's a truly generational effort. We're here to say that we really need to get this right? And the draft that the city is looking at right now has come a long way in addressing what we see as the sort of best practices, but we're here to say we can do better, right? And so just big picture, been really tiring and also really rewarding to work on a proposed draft ordinance or changes to the city's ordinance that's informed by, personal experiences from tenants in struggle right here at home in Santa Barbara. Unlike a lot of policy wonkery, right? We've actually had like dozens and dozens of tenants who have combed through ordinance language to share their input, to help craft policy from their own lived experiences. This is, seniors on a fixed income. This is tenants facing rent eviction, middle-class families, homeowners, people who are trying to start families, and also people who are wondering if their families can afford to stay here, right? And then, we also, of course, have been pulling from policy best practices from around the state, in 2026, right? So policy experts who drafted ordinances like those in Richmond, Alameda, Pasadena, LA, West Hollywood, Mountain View, and a lot more have helped shape this. the changes that we're proposing. And so I think just for our portion of it, we were thinking we'd highlight a few of the major changes to the proposed draft that all of that insight that we've been able to collect, we want to highlight, and then we could get into, Q&A. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, like Stanley mentioned, this is a long time coming, being born and raised in Santa Barbara. I've seen how Santa Barbara has shifted and changed throughout the years. I have also shared in my own personal experience that, like, even though I've been a renter my whole adult life, I do have family members who are small landlords, and who have properties here, who I have also shared what the rent stabilization ordinance, how it would apply for them. So, because that's also very important for me, and being able to see like the changes, being able to see like now that I'm still here, a lot of people who I grew up with aren't, they had to move away. They had to move to North County or to Ventura, or, people that like we had plans to like, raise our kids together, and we can't because they can't afford to be here, and don't have the privileges of like that I had with my family, being able to have like those safety nets, on those moments where, I was displaced, I had places to go locally. So it's very important also to understand that this isn't something that we just like out of thin air, we're like, this is great, this is what we're pushing for. This is something like how Stanley says, a lot of time and effort went into it. And we also had to do a lot of compromises throughout the years, and a lot of learning as well, to get to this point where we're at this moment, and realize this is a moderate rent stabilization ordinance that will be beneficial not only for the tenants, but for everybody in Santa Barbara, so that we can thrive here and have stability and in the city.
So the first thing we wanted to highlight, and it's a long list, but we try to stick to three main topics. But one is, the makeup and authority of the rent board, right? So this is, as Carrie, really thoroughly went through, right? There's three main components of rent stabilization. There's a rent cap, which is probably the most well-known piece of it. There's also a rental registry, right? A listing of properties. And then there's a rent board, right? That's meant to carry this out, to enforce things. So there's kind of two main things that we'd like to see changed. One is the rent board should be have more authority, right? Right now, as it seems, there's no authority beyond hearing appeals. They can only approve regulation from the administrator. They can only meet once a year. The composition is majority property owner, which we'll talk a little bit more about. They can't address ad hoc committees to address issues as they come up, and and they don't even have the ability to influence selection or attention of independent hearing officers. And I think,
but I do want to highlight that Carrie did mention that with the new adjustments, to be able to provide like input, right? To in the future, like for the ordinance, right?
That the board would be able to. Yeah, I see.
Yeah,
clarify that.
Yeah, there is a policy advocacy, advisory.
I see. Yeah, right.
Yes.
Okay, so they could help shape.
So we might see that in the next draft, right?
So these notes are from what is in the current draft. So I wonder if the way it's written, because often ordinance language is so confusing, and I appreciate
totally,
everyone who read all 36 pages. But that there's a note about it currently.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, so maybe that's something, yes, to clarify, making sure that it's clearly stated, because when we read it, it wasn't clearly emphasized that they would be able to have that. And so when we come for the first reading, making sure that that's clear, that would be something that they have authority to do.
So I think the bottom line, is we want a place that is, so many like processes can be opaque or confusing, not by design, not just de facto. So we want an accessible and transparent board where if landlords or tenants have a problem, that they can go to a regular rent board meeting. It's democratic. It has enforcement capabilities. And then we want it to actually center tenant voices, right? So, it's a board charged with enforcing and creating tenant protection policies. So it should lean on the experiences of tenants. And right now, there's only 2 tenant spots on a board of 7. It's not a business roundtable. It's not it's like having the I don't know, manufacturer of a product on have the majority of a consumer protection board or something. And we think that's an issue of both insight and strengthening the role of the board. Also, it's an issue of equity. Property owners we're pushing back on an uneven playing field where property owners have way more sway and political power in the city, and certainly seen that throughout this long process. And then it's an issue of democracy, right? Having close to 60% of tenants on the board reflects the demographic makeup of the city that we're in. And so that's when we're talking all this policy talk, but I'm thinking of 2 people. There's so many that I could bring up, but I'm thinking of 2 people who would benefit from a rent board that's made up like that. One is Luce and her family. They've been here for decades. They've needed roof repair that's needed significant repairs. They're dealing with mold. Her neighbor Leo can't turn on 2 appliances at the same time, despite much heralded renovations by their landlord. And Luce and Leo and their families and the hundreds and thousands, hundreds if not thousands of tenants in their position are a good example of why we don't need just any rent board to check a box, but we need one that actually centers experiences like theirs, right? They've exhausted every possible avenue. They've gone to the mediation board, gone to the city investigative code enforcement. They've really exhausted all options, and they can't really, going to court isn't really an option unless they threaten to withhold rent, in which case they're risking their own housing for repairs that they could go to, right? That they need fixed. So for most people, that's just not accessible, right? And if a board is majority not tenants on a rent board, it doesn't seem right. And so I'll pass it to Anna to talk about the second sort of major change we'd like highlighted.
Yeah. So the second major change would be no exceptions above what's required by state law. Currently, as it's written, it would be 60% of units having an exemption. And but I do, want to give you the city staff some kudos because as it's written, it does exempt Section 8 voucher holders. So that is a big, win in making sure that that families who have a Section 8 voucher and are with private landlords are protected, especially right now, as we have seen with the mixed status rules and like the federal changes that are happening. It is very important that they're protected because we have witnessed like some folks who come to us like experiencing threats and experiencing fears and being evicted from their units. So this is something that's very important for them to be able to go to a place where in the city, with the rent board or somewhere that's enforceable, that they can advocate for themselves. And then also noting that because of going back to the 60 units that are exempt, when we put exemptions like off the gate, it's also placing a bullseye into these units and these complexes to have big developments purchase these units because of their exceptions, and also not including them puts us in that hypothetical situations where we don't really have a clear picture of is it helping or not helping the situation about having these exceptions. So it's important to have strong protections off the gate so that way we can see, okay, if it's too strong, then we can adjust from there. But if we exempt them and don't include them and we don't include them in the overall picture, then we're coming back to city council, which I know all our city council members love us advocating So we continue to come back because we see all these loopholes that are happening, right? And so, and that's a problem. And while we're advocating, we're seeing more people getting displaced and having it be counterproductive, right? And we also want to emphasize that we're not talking about units, housing units that are built after 1995. So it's very important to highlight that. We're talking about buildings, like senior buildings, like the Battistone Foundation, buildings that have like funky like covenants, and were created like prior to, these conversations that don't have strong protections. And then, reminder that where this is a rent stabilization ordinance and it's to center tenants first, right? And for the protections of tenants. And so by excluding these units, we're saying like, you're not worth being protected. And we're not giving a space that's clear, that's transparent, and that's why I love Santa Barbara too, because the Santa Barbara way is protecting your community and being a part of the community and saying like, you're welcome here, and when we're not saying that within our protections and within our policies, we're saying you're not worthy of protection. And so that's why it's important to ensure that we have the strongest protections possible so people in both sides are able to have a clear, transparent, public process to be able to go to and share what's the issue. So, yeah,
Anna, I have
Yeah.
a question though,
of course, yeah.
just to kind of push back a little
Of
bit.
course.
I personally often take my cue from the Housing Authority
Mhm.
and Rob Fredericks, and I know he has been concerned that, for example, Section 8 housing, for those of you out
Yeah.
there don't know what that is, that's people who get vouchers to live. They have to find landlords to
Mhm.
offer that. And his concern is that it's already difficult enough to find landlords. If you add another layer, it'll make it even more difficult. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. I think our council member Wendy Santamaria said it beautifully in the dais, where it's like we're even above and beyond like meeting our numbers when it comes to voucher holders and like voucher holders who have Section 8 with private landlords in our city. So there's no like
That's not a concern.
it's not a concern in regards to that. And then also keeping in mind that there's different subsections of
Yeah.
like vouchers. So just because, you're in one area, like with mixed status, for example, what we learned is that it's not just the 30% that you're paying. If you're in a mixed status family, the person who doesn't have citizenship doesn't qualify for those like subsidized fees. And if you want to continue
Yeah.
on, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the theoretical, right,
Yeah.
like no additional regulations on landlords. Of course, we want landlords to participate in the Section 8 housing program. Right now, what Anna was speaking to in regards to like deed restricted housing, which is different, right? Those another concern is, though the rent cap on those is defined with the area median income, not consumer price index. That measurement can spike up much quicker. And so because of that, people's rents can spike up much quicker. And it's just a lot more volatile. And then on top of that, right, like taking a step back, this is a set of tenant protections. Why should a tenant who happens to live in an affordable housing development or be a Section 8 housing not be subject to having a place where they could go down the street on Garden Street or wherever it's going to be, where they can go talk to a rent board and have a one-stop shop where they can have their issues heard? Some of the regulatory frameworks, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is, well, the counter arguments we've heard is, well, they can go to HUD, right? The Housing and Urban Development. In a time when like it's the same administration that is, mass agents are intimidating and picking people up off the street, we want to send them to the same office. There's no because rent stabilization again includes all these protections beyond just the rent cap, right? So, when we're looking at exempting certain people at the end of this process, are we going to say, well, certain people will be protected and others won't be in 2026? I just don't think that we would feel good about that. And at the end of the day, why should we exclude some of the people who are the most working class and on fixed incomes? It can be discriminatory, right? And so, and love the Housing Authority. They do incredible work. We just don't think that we should exempt tenants just because they happen to be in affordable housing units from having access to a rent board, to having their issues addressed in the city.
I have a question, because, a lot of those, I mean, especially if you have a deed restricted rental unit, you have a very low rental
Yeah.
rate already, right? And so now, and we also have a rental registry fee.
Mhm.
So have you considered the interplay between those two things?
Yeah, a lot of other places, the fee that we're talking about, it's like $7 a month for the landlord and $7 for the tenant.
Per unit, though.
Yeah, per unit.
So if you had a bigger apartment building with deed restricted units in it,
Mhm.
for example.
Yeah, I mean, there's fee waivers also, right? So a lot of other places, I believe if it's an affordable housing unit, or if somebody's on Section 8 or under a certain income, there can be waivers to that $7 a month. So I think that's how some municipalities deal with that. And I'll just say really quickly, the last point we wanted to make, and this is a quick one. So we talked about the rent board, we talked about not adding on more exemptions than the 60% of units that are already not covered. And the last one is just that rent stabilization is an anti-displacement protection. And there's just cause just cause protection. So just cause is, in short, that you can't just get evicted from your home for no reason, right? There's a certain set of reasons why you can be evicted if you don't do anything wrong, right? So we need to make a set of changes to have the just cause eviction protections meet the pressure that they'll be under once we pass rent stabilization. So tenant protections are like a three-legged stool. You need all three to work very well together. One is rent stabilization, which we're talking about. Another is that you can't just be evicted for no reason. And the third one is habitability enforcement, right? Because if you don't have one of these, a bad actor landlord can pressure you out of your spot. So the rent freeze, for example, covered owner-occupied duplexes, but just cause doesn't. So one of our members in the tenants union got a rent increase during the freeze that was illegal. They said no, right? And then got an eviction notice. So if we don't pay attention to just cause, or avoid addressing it right now, and we have a list of what that looks like, or address it all as then people can be in trouble, right? Because they could be forced out because a landlord doesn't want to abide by the other rules that we're passing.
So just get a little clarity on that.
Yeah.
And right now Santa Barbara has a pretty good just cause ordinance, which protects against rent eviction. I mean, we had a fight over that lasted over two city council, as I recall. And that means that a landlord, cannot raise the rent and upgrade the place and evict somebody.
Yeah.
The tenant has a right to return. How would you strengthen that? Is it just extending it to duplexes or other places, or what's the main?
Yeah, I think the coverage of it matters, right? The owner occupied duplex is just an example. There's the exemptions that currently are proposed around folks in units that are affordable.
And then
missing anything? I
also
feel like I'm missing
another
something.
big one is no fault eviction protections during the school year. Because as we have seen a lot of school age and educational staff, when there is a no fault, during the school year, it can drastically create trauma and, change their day-to-day. And it also impacts enrollment within our school system and our families here that are able to live here. So that was another big one.
Yeah. Yeah, or for example, like the Ellis Act,
Mhm.
you know, this is sort of the next horizon, right? If
Explain what the.
yeah,
LSA
yeah, totally. Not everybody's deep in this like we are. So the Ellis Act basically says, look, if you're a property owner, you have the constitutional right to go out of business in California, right? That means that you know, one of the just cause evictions, right? One of the reasons you can be evicted, aside from it being red tagged or there being substantial repairs or family move in, is that you're taking it off the market, right? What we're seeing in other places is without closing some loopholes on that exemption, you see bad faith landlords coming in saying, "Oh, I'm fine. Oh, I can't raise the rent. Oh, I can't evict you. I can't maintain my property. Well, I'm going out of business." Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. They don't actually, in good faith, do that, and they bring it back on the market right away. And there's not adequate sort of penalties or protections against that. So other places that have passed this, we can anticipate, you know, they have been confronted with this issue. And so we might as well get ahead of it, right?
Yeah. And I also want to emphasize that like we've already exhausted every other avenue, you know, like we have the tenant help desk, like with Santa Barbara Tenants Union, like folks have gone to, you know, the mediation board, which they do the best that they can, you know, they've come to city council, they've gone to code enforcement, gone to legal aid, you know, there's been so many places that they have already gone, and like the system is so complicating. And even like within the housing authority, I know that they're doing the best that they can, and having a clear, transparent, public you know, pathway and like process that everybody can go to, it just creates that streamline a lot easier for our community members, right? And then, like I said, we've already tried every single other way that we could, and this all paths leads to this, and this is our Oz, you know, for this, you know, and like you said, it's one piece of the greater issue of what's going on with the housing affordability crisis here in Santa Barbara. So this is one piece of the major puzzle of everything else that we need, you know, fund the local housing trust fund, you know, get like better development and like try to tie everything together, you know, so, yeah.
Are there any questions coming from
There's-
I have many questions.
Yeah,
Let's
there's
listen.
one, and they asked, do these rules and regulations include Carpinteria?
No, this is
No.
just the city of Santa
Yeah.
Barbara.
However, of course, there's a caveat. I will say we should treat this with the gravity that this is a regional issue. Because one, the housing issue doesn't stop at the city limits. But two, as we saw with other tenant protections, cities like Carpinteria, Goleta, the county sometimes, they look to what Santa Barbara is doing, right? Anecdotally, we know that they're looking to see what Santa Barbara is going to do. And so that puts a little more pressure on us to get it right? Because other cities will likely follow suit. But no, unfortunately, only applies to the city of Santa Barbara.
One more just pop up. Peter Rupert, UCSB Econ Forecast, argues rent control has the exact opposite effect than the intent on housing costs. What is the best rebuttal to that argument?
Let me
Yeah.
take that one. So Peter Rupert is a respected economist. He's the Economic Forecast Project. And he was on Newsmakers, our little local, you know, TV show. And he said exactly what the question implies, that rent control is a disaster, that it discourages new construction, which by the way is exempted under rent stabilization.
Right.
And so on and so forth. I then went on Newsmakers and gave the counter argument. So another fact that just came to my attention, this was actually raised by Gail Marshall, who's head of the Great Panthers. She'd read something, that question probably came from her also, maybe.
Barbara.
That she read somewhere in the New York Times recently that something like 80 or 90% of economists, I think that rent control is a disaster. So let me say a few words about that. I actually did a little research on it. I want to get this right. So that figure, 80% of economists think that rent control is a disaster. it's one of these ideas that gets cycled periodically. The origin is a study that was done in 2012. It was a survey, actually, of 42 leading economists at major universities from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and a so-called experts panel. So let me just read you what the question was. The panel was asked to rate their agreement with the statement: local ordinances that limit rent increases for some rental housing units, such as in New York and San Francisco, have had a positive effect over the past 3 decades on the amount and quality of broadly affordable rental housing in cities that have used them. And 34 of the 42, I guess, which works out to 81%, totally disagreed with that statement. Well, the problem is, among many other things, that, well, I'll name 2 problems. One, a very specific problem, is that that was first generation rent control,
Right.
not rent stabilization, which exempts, which under law in California, as we've seen, exempts new construction, provides for vacancy decontrol, and so on. So it's totally irrelevant.
Right.
It's also true that economists, as an article of faith, believe that the market will solve all problems, even in the face of all evidence to the contrary. And it's the topic I can really get into. Let me raise another example of this, which I found fascinating. Last year, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, which of course is authoritative for many people, that pointed out that when St. Paul, Minnesota, passed rent control in 2021, permits plummeted 79%, whereas in neighboring Minneapolis, pretty much the same housing market, there was no problem. What the article didn't mention was that, again, it was old school rent control in St. Paul. And that it had no vacancy decontrol, it fixed rents at a certain amount, and so on and so forth. So the city council of St. Paul changed that and made it into moderate rent control, rent stabilization ordinance. And interestingly enough, the next survey showed that Minneapolis, with no rent control, actually had worse housing performance than St. Paul. So,
Wow.
it's really important to kind of follow the dots and trace out these arguments.
Yeah.
I'll just name 2 other things on the more positive side. The National Bureau of Economic Research, last March 2025, actually, did a study of 300 US metropolitan areas from 1980 to 2020. And it found that housing costs were driven not by supply issues. In economist terms, the housing market did an elasticity, that is, how much new construction reduces the price, had nothing to do with it. This was a highly complicated statistical study. And it said the housing costs are driven by demand side factors such as consumer income and remote work status, which brings me to my final point. Santa Barbara is the kind of place where the demand for housing is virtually infinite, because people can work remotely from here, wealthy people. So simply building more housing won't solve the problem. I said that's a topic for another discussion.
Yeah.
We're not
Yep.
focused on that. But rent stabilization itself, and I did a whole bunch of research, which is actually in this book and a lot of other research back in the day, where we looked at moderate rent controlled cities. And we found there was no effect on new construction or anything. And this was before new construction was exempted.
Wow.
So let me be quiet on that. Unless someone wants to comment, I have more questions myself. Can I ask a couple?
Yeah.
Okay, so one point that has been made, what about units that are good person landlords that are way below market? The landlord has been really a decent person and has charged rents which are below typical rents for those units. Shouldn't they be exempt? What's your answer to that question? Why not?
Well, it's great that they're good people. It's great that they're doing business well, and they shouldn't have to worry about it, right? If you're doing business well, if you're maintaining your properties, if you're budgeting, and look, I think, I don't know if people know this, but there is a constitutionally required right to a fair return, right? So this is that the law says you have to be allowed this as a property owner. And so in the situation where and nobody's really painted a very specific picture on who this would actually apply for, because a lot of the opponents that we hear about talking about this it's like the theoretical sort of, right? But in the situation where, for example, let's say there's a property owner who's on a fixed income, maybe has one rental unit, and all of a sudden they have to repair the roof, right, or the foundation, or replace the plumbing or electrical circuit, which happens, right? These are old buildings. There's an appeals process that is absolutely guaranteed. It's well vetted. Other places do this, and they get to go down to the local one-stop office where they get to actually make their case known and have an exemption or a hardship waiver, and they get to address that. And so I think if anybody's, I'll just add also as tenants, we're the first people who want those landlords who are doing a good job, who are maintaining their properties, who are keeping rents relatively reasonable. We're the first ones who would want to protect those landlords from staying in town, right? Because we're the first hit. So, so this is already built in to the process. If anything, it's more case by case. And so I don't think if there's a landlord in that position that they should worry at all. If anything, it sets more commonplace rules of the road that everybody can kind of follow.
But why cover them? I mean, I have my own answer to
Yeah.
this, but I'm gonna push a little bit.
Sure.
Since they are keeping their rents below what the
Yeah.
rent stabilization ordinance would require anyhow.
Mhm.
So what's the danger in giving them a gold star and saying?
Well, they can get a gold star. We should have the Office of Gold Stars, and we should make a wall for them. Well, I mean, this is meant to stabilize the rents for tenants. So while a tenant is in that building, they can expect and make plans with their family as to how much their rent can expect to go up.
Creates predictability.
It creates predictability. If you're a business owner, as a landlord, you also should be able to budget along that predictability, right? And again, there's a whole process for sort of extreme circumstances. And also, lest we forget, it's not just the rent cap, right? The rent stabilization ordinance is a place where you can go when habitability and safety concerns aren't being addressed. And so it's more than just the cap. And so I don't see a reason why we should exempt tenants just because they happen to live in those units.
I have sort of a factual question, which Carolyn, maybe you can address, or maybe. So, as we know, maybe a little more than half of the units, I think, in Santa Barbara are covered because under Costa-Hawkins 1995 Act, newer units aren't. So, we have a lot of old units here. So I guess there are two questions that I've heard. One, is it fair to only cover, half, a little more than half the units? And secondly, the rental registry. Will that apply just to covered units or to all units in the city?
But at this point, the way the ordinance is written is that the registry is for covered units. I do think that is something that people are weighing in on and comment, and the conversation is open for it. In terms of what we're legally allowed to do, that's capped with the 1995 by the state. So there's not a lot of local wiggle room there.
For the
There's
cap, not the
for
registry.
the covered unit.
For the rent cap.
So anything after 1995 is not going to be a covered unit because it's newer construction.
For the rent increase cap.
For to do
The registry,
I get it.
yeah,
Yes.
I just want to clarify. So
what
units.
is your position?
Well, sure, it's shocking to hear, right? But we think everybody should be covered in the rental registry. The registry is a tool that I think a lot of people are shocked to hear. You all will not be, but a lot of people there are shocked to hear, I think, that as a city, we have no real understanding of who owns what, how many units we have, how much rents are, et cetera. And a rental registry is a listing exactly that. Why we should not list it's something like 20,000 units or something would be exempt as it's currently written from the rental registry, right? I don't know why we would want to do that. It would exempt like government subsidized, restricted, single family homes, anything built after 1995. Why would we not, as a city, want to know that those units exist and who owns them and how much rents are, as we're making public policy decisions? I just, that's wild to me. Seems like we're doing our city a disservice.
And not that I'm weighing in because I think there's good arguments
Yeah,
in
yeah.
both ways,
No,
but
no.
I do think that there is a complexity
Sure.
argument to be
Right.
made. So like, yes, there's a pragmatic argument to be like, if as a city, if we had all the information and we
Yeah.
could run reports, that sounds great.
Yeah.
And it does. But there's a compliant, like, how do you get people to do the thing? And what does compliance look like? And how are we enforcing it? And how are we going out and looking? And that there's staff time. So I think that some of those choices or conversations are pragmatic.
Yeah.
Around like, how does that, what does it look like if you require everybody to do it?
Well, if I could, so I agree it's complex, but in some ways it's more simple, right? It's the staff time. This is a self-funding program. There's no additional cost to the program because you're also collecting fees on those. And it's true. I think what I think is valuable maybe to point out is, the registry in its narrow definition is an enforcement mechanism, right? If we're not able to cap the rent increases on those units, why would we even need to know, to maintain a database of them? But I think that that's a too limited of a view into what a rental registry could do. In terms of staff time, yeah, again, it's a self-funding, public
Although the
program.
more complex the program gets, the more staff you have, the more either the rate goes up or it's not covered. So I do think it is a consideration
Right.
that is being discussed. And again, like, I absolutely, from a data management perspective, the more data that we can have, the more we can make informed decisions. So there's a very pragmatic
Yeah.
argument, I think, kind of in both directions.
You could also argue it's more complex to figure out which ones to carve out and exempt versus just say, look, all units are included. So anyway, but yeah, I hear your point.
These are issues which somehow magically will all be worked out in the long run, and everybody will be happy.
Yeah.
To the point of it's really important to get it right. I
Yeah,
do
totally.
think that this is a really important conversation to think through, and not just in terms of, what the ideal is, but like the complexity of how it's gonna work.
Yeah.
And then, if we can have the more people who can actually read the ordinance and the more people who can really think about that and weigh in and do this public comment,
Yeah.
the more we have to look at in terms of where the community is. So just really encouraging people to read through the 36 pages, even though it's tedious, and really think about the implications of it and their own thoughts on like how this all shakes out.
But along those lines, all you folks out there in Zoom land, if you go to the City of Santa Barbara website, there'll be a link there, I'm sure.
Yes, on the rent if you look at Rent Stabilization Santa Barbara, there is information there. You can put a public comment in.
Right, there's tons of information, and there's an email address you can send your public comment to.
Yeah. RSO? No, I think it's RSO.
RSO at
Santa Barbara ca.gov.
Yes.
RSO at santabarbaracity.gov.
You have till midnight tomorrow.
Santa Barbara CA.
Until midnight
Oh, yeah,
tomorrow.
can you clarify
Yeah.
that? Because earlier you said it was until 5, but we were told that
No,
it
it
was
was
until
the end
midnight.
of the day,
Yeah.
and then I think the 5 is when the meeting's gonna start at 5. On the
Which-
28th.
Oh,
So on the 28th,
so
the
this
city council
Friday
meeting.
though,
but this Friday it's end of day was the note.
end
So
of
I
day
take that
or
to be
end?
midnight.
Okay, okay.
Now we're saying it publicly.
And what
Okay,
happens-
midnight, yeah, okay,
What happens on the
Uh-huh.
28th?
yeah.
We're gonna have a city council meeting where this will be discussed.
Mark your calendars.
The first reading.
28th
Yeah.
city council meeting will start at what time
Yeah.
for this?
5 PM
5 o'clock.
and I think, I mean, that
Bring your
I don't
sleeping
know that it's
bags.
published yet, but I know I was gonna say, drink some coffee.
Yeah, bring some snacks.
Tune in, yes, so.
Any more questions out there?
No.
Let me ask,
Larry.
no,
Is there a hand raised? I
Larry
think?
has
Larry?
his hand up.
Oh, okay, hand raised.
Yeah, I've got a question about the likelihood down the road of an injunction brought by property owners to stay the effect of the rent stabilization, which seems to me to be, and the fact that they'll seek an injunction seems to me to be a certainty. The fact that they will get an injunction is certainly something we need to plan for. Um, in that event, will the current rent moratorium automatically stay in place?
The current rent moratorium, the way that it's written now, ends on December 31st. And so in order for it to stay in place beyond that, there would need to be an amendment to that ordinance.
Um, then I would recommend to the great minds on this topic, which I'm not one, that you consider in the ordinance including an extension of the moratorium. So the moratorium stays in place until such time as the rent stabilization is effective. Um, it would seem to me otherwise that trying to backfill and create a new rent moratorium in the event of an injunction is going to be problematic in a number of ways. At first, it may leave a time gap where the moratorium is not in effect and rents can be increased. Second, it's possible that the injunction itself would prevent a new moratorium. Of course, it's also possible the injunction would also wipe out an existing moratorium, but I mean, we can only do what we can do.
Yeah.
I hate to be, the one
No, that's
looking at the
great.
glass being half empty.
Yeah.
Good,
Yeah, just-
good point to bring up, yeah.
Yeah.
a clarification for anyone out there who doesn't know about the moratorium. That was put in place because there is concern that while this is being debated, landlords would raise rents through the roof to head things off the path, so that prevents it. And your point is that it's gonna take a while for this ordinance to take effect, even if it's adopted in January. Yeah, it's probably a couple of years startup, so
Mhm.
how do you protect tenants during that time?
Yeah, we not only heard those threats from a few loud voices in City Hall giving public comment on the other side, but also we actually, in the weeks following, we did get reports of people who all of a sudden were getting these intense rent increases. So I think it's a really real fear. We certainly, anecdotally at least, have seen this quite a bit. And I also want to remind people that just because you file a lawsuit doesn't mean it's on legally sturdy ground. It is a negotiation tactic, and it's certainly being wielded that way. And I think it's wild that that there's a lawsuit against the city, which is like forcing us to use city funds instead of maybe protecting our neighbors or taking care of other pressing issues is used to like defend a legally precarious lawsuit.
Are there more?
I had to say that.
Other questions? I can always come up with another question. I'll come with one final question
Yeah.
perhaps. There's gonna be startup cost.
Yeah.
And that's been estimated at how much? I've seen $1 million or something bandied about, or
I mean, I think that it will depend on how, if when we can get fees coming in from the rental registry component, I think that we do have this language that the registry will be required by January 1st
Mm,
in an attempt to have some income
Income.
coming in and help offset it. It will depend on staff, really, and like the implementation team, and we really don't know what that looks
but
like yet. So,
realistically, there's got to be a gap between
yes,
January
it will,
1st.
it will cost
Right.
the city money in that time
So-
period.
Here's a prediction on June 28th
Uh-huh,
at 5 o'clock.
yeah.
You will hear many voices there
Mhm.
saying, city's broke. The city has a budget deficit, a crisis.
Mhm.
Where's the money gonna come from to make this happen?
We did build in funds to cover startup in the fiscal year 27 budget.
mhm. And I believe it's structured like a loan, right? It's
Yes.
going to be repaid back by the
Yeah,
fees as
yeah.
soon as we have them. And less, I think it's important to look at the cost of not doing something.
Okay, we're a little early here, but
And
Anything
Gail
else?
just
Okay.
commented, she said, Rich, please remember to give a pitch for going Gray Panther.
There we go.
Mhm.
what?
Give a
Get a
pitch for
pitch.
going to the
Ah.
Gray Panthers.
Yes, so go to our website, the Santa Barbara Great Panther Network. You will see we've had dozens of forums over the few years since we've existed on topics with all sorts of people. And we advocate, we educate, and we do agitate occasionally on issues that matter to us. You can join. It's a very modest fee to be part of our mailing list, which is quite extensive now. I think there are several hundred people on it.
Well,
Almost 600.
whoa.
Almost 600.
Um,
Wow. So make it 700. So come join, we sort of have a sliding scale anyhow. We really want to hear your voices. We have an annual membership meeting, where we sort of decide on new programs, policies and stuff like that, to which all of our members are invited. So, join the Great Panthers. Let me say one other thing about it in case nobody out there knows. The Great Panthers were started in the 1970s, right around the time I was right. And it was for older people to be part of the action during the anti-war civil rights movement and so on. Started by a woman named Maggie Kuhn. In Santa Barbara, our board includes former supervisors, former mayors, people who have been active. And while I totally believe in the importance of young people getting into politics, I do think this may be self-serving. There's some wisdom of some sort that comes with having been around, especially in a small community like Santa Barbara. When you have sat up there in the city council seats or in the board of supervisors and know what's happening. So I do think that we bring something to the table, a little wisdom and advocacy for older adults, as well as everybody. Youth and age and action, that's another one of our slogans or something like that.
That's great.
Plus my wife designed the logo, so.
Oh,
Right.
great.
So thank you all for being here
Yeah, thank you.
and
Thank you.
get to the website, write your opinions down, let your voice be heard, and show
Yes.
up on the 28th.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, all.
I know.
And thanks to our panelists and thanks,
Thanks for putting it
Ava
together.
for making
Yeah,
this
thank you,
happen.
guys.
Right.